Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our second session in Analyzing Complex Systems. I'm Maria Brendlemeyer. I'm the Senior Knowledge Management Specialist with YouthPower Learning and Evaluation, or as we call it lovingly, YP2LE. For those of you who are new to YouthPower or YP2LE, you will have seen the slides while you were in the waiting room. And if you missed those slides, please go to youthpower.org and you will be able to find more information about the project and positive youth development. And also, if you did not join us for the first session, in this training, please go also to the website. You will find the recording of the first session there, and that may give you some additional background for analyzing complex systems. We also encourage all of you to join the communities of practice. This is the first set of webinars in our new Learning Network series and part of our rollout of the new communities of practice. So please do go and register on youthpower.org and then join our 3 communities of practice that are available now with additional ones to come. So as I said, this is the first set of webinars in the series, and it's offered by our YP2LE partner, GKI, and we have the GKI team ready to get going. So let me hand it over to Hina. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Welcome, everyone. It's really great to see you. If you attended the first session, welcome back. If you are new, we're really excited to have you. We have a packed agenda today, so we will get started right away. As Maria said, this is the second series of a 3-part Analyzing Complex Systems workshop. For those of you who attend all 3 events, we offer a certificate of completion for your attendance. And to get the certificate, you'll need to attend all 3 sessions and then complete a short quiz or an assignment that we send after each session. Now I will pass it on to Katie to introduce you to our agenda for the day.
Thanks, Hina. So today, as Hina said, is going to be a very fast-paced agenda. It's perhaps going to feel a bit uncomfortable because we are moving really, really fast through a lot of information. We also know that last session also felt really fast, and this one will probably feel even more, even shorter than the last. So we want to recognize that we know that looping is hard and it will feel uncomfortable, and that's okay. But we did design these sessions to give you as much time practicing and engaging with others as possible. And so by the end of this series of training, you won't be a causal loop diagram expert, but you will know lots about causal loop diagramming. And there are many parts that we will mention and perhaps not have time to practice in this training. However, we hope that this training does give you a taste of what it could look like if you facilitated this process with an organization, a project, or a community. And so if you are interested in learning more, we have a ton of resources and training agendas and learning journeys that we can share with you to continue your learning journey with causal loop diagram and system sensing. So for today, we will be doing a quick introduction and recap of the last session. Jesse, if you can actually go back. We'll be doing a quick recap of the last session. So for those who weren't in the last session, you'll still be able to get the basics of causal loop diagramming. Then we'll work in a large group to create loops on our own and then have a share out. And then we'll be moving into smaller groups, breakout groups, where we'll be working in our breakout groups to create a loop together, which will give you an idea of what this might feel like if we're facilitating the process with a community or an organization. And then we'll have a quick wrap up at the end. Just for reference, Jessie Bellama is our tech lead for the day. So if you're having any challenges, please reach out to her. And lastly, we would like to keep all questions to the chat when we're in the full group. Your time to be speaking to each other will be in the breakout groups or when we prompt you to speak. So let's meet our trainers before we jump into the recap of the last session. Next slide, Jessie. So as I haven't said, I am Katie Stafford and I'll be one of your co-facilitators for today. I am really happy to see so many people here today. I hope that many of you have either joined the last webinar or have watched it since, but it's quite exciting to be walking you all through this journey of systems mapping and causal loop diagramming. I'll pass it over to Morgan to introduce herself and then to Hina.
Thank you, Katie. My name is Morgan Bruce. I'm co-facilitating today and I'm an associate at GKI. I'm a knowledge management and data visualization specialist, a bit of a data geek, you might call me, but my real interest is in using data tools to get people talking. And that's the angle I'll be bringing to most of the things I'll be talking about today. Thank you, and hand it over to Hina.
Thanks, Morgan. Thanks, Katie. My name is Hina Acharya, and I'm your co-facilitator today, and I also serve as the communities manager for the YouthPower Learning Network. So for the past year, I've worked really closely with the YP2LE team to facilitate the co-creation of a refreshed network design. As communities manager, I want to ensure that the network is inclusive, productive, and engaging to all of its members, and I'm really excited to be here and see you all again. Thanks. Next slide, please, Jessie.
So I'll quickly walk us through our learning journey for the 3 sessions. If you were able to attend session 1, you will know that we walked participants through the basics of systems mapping. In the session today, we hope that it will be much more experiential and we'll be working together in small groups to create loops. And then in the future session, session 3, we'll be using the map that we create in session 2 to determine leverage and talk about how a map might create space for conversations, as Morgan has said, and help inform strategic decisions. So I do want to let you all know that because this process is very condensed and short, we only have 90 minutes today. And we know that this is not enough time to create an entire map. Generally, we say about an hour for each loop is what's necessary when you're doing it in a group format. So like I said earlier, it will feel very short, very condensed, but through today's session, we are attempting to replicate the process of facilitating the creation of a causal loop diagram. We're hoping that this will give you an idea of what it could look like in a actual workshop format, whether that be virtual or in person. And so we hope that today will be interactive and fun, and we'll have your full engagement and excitement on what we're learning. And then one other point, for session 3, you do have to sign up separately for that session. So if you wish to join us on November 17th, please follow the link that we'll send at the end of this webinar and sign up for the next session. So I'll pass it over to Morgan to give us a quick recap and introduction of what we went through last week, or 2 weeks ago.
Hi everyone, it's good to have you all here. Last week, together we took a whirlwind tour of systems thinking and how to use dynamic and intelligent framing, how to use that dynamic and intelligent framing in our work. As you can see labeled above, we acknowledge that we're already systems thinking experts, and together we agreed on ways to apply our skills intentionally in all phases of our work. From the earliest design stages through adapting and iterating, and generally as an approach that takes our very human irrationalities into account, trying to work with honesty and intention rather than reacting to changes as they come up. Next slide, please. Along the way, we explored frameworks for integrating systems approaches into a product or initiative cycles. starting with gathering experiences from your community, co-designing a strategy with this community, facilitating collaboration, new partnerships, and ways of working towards a goal, and finally monitoring the approach through community feedback and adapting as you gain a better understanding of the community needs. Of course, this visual doesn't quite capture that this iterative decision-making needs to be used across every stage of the cycle and never really ends. Next slide, please. Finally, we got stuck into one of many ways to visualize a system, causal loop diagrams. At GKI, we find that causal loop diagramming can be a really valuable process for projects or initiatives that are at 4 different types of turning points. Firstly, when you're in an initial design or a launch phase and the complexity of the challenge is difficult to untangle. When you find yourself at an inflection point where the path forward is not yet clear. When you're stuck or not making the desired progress and you believe collective action is needed to shift the system. And finally, when you or an actor you're working with is trying to influence the system at a macro level rather than just specific interventions. Next slide, please. The output of all this is a really exciting map or a visual, sometimes a narrative of a complex interactions of cause and effects. And from this, we identify with clearly identified and actionable areas of intervention. This is the bit that people get really excited about. You can see I've just put an example up on the screen. It's very compelling and attractive, and it can be used for all sorts of strategic leveraging conversations. Situations that felt complex and unwieldy feel clear, and we're given a shared language to explore them, but that's not where its usefulness ends. The real magic of a well-facilitated causal loop diagramming process is that it gets people talking. Through mapping out the forces and loops at play, actors get to explore their own understanding and engage with their perspective or experience. And all of this becomes just one piece of the cut puzzle. They also work to reconcile their perspective with other people's views, even if those views are really divergent from their own. And from there, we develop hypotheses and identify energy flow. Actors can work together to collectively analyze how the energy is flowing through the system, understand where there are opportunities to make change, to interrupt cycles or find leverage. Finally, based on interest and resources available, system actors can prioritize areas for intervention. The magic, again, is to get people talking. We're getting them to properly grapple with and to integrate different human experiences, be prepared for unexpected consequences of their own actions, and be aware of how others' actions play into their own understanding of the world and how to intervene with those in mind. I'll pass it back to Hina to move into what we'll be working on today.
We have 2 objectives for the day. First of all, you will learn how to navigate the experience of facilitating a causal loop diagram process. And then objective 2 is you will get more comfortable with drawing loops and knowing when to use a CLD. I have a note here that echoes what Morgane just said, and we really want to drive this point home. So remember that the finished map is only a part of the process. And I say this because oftentimes we tend to think of the finished map as the most critical part of the process. However, it's important to remember that mapping is just a tool. The real impact comes from when you gather a group of people in a room, virtual or in a real life room, to create a causal loop diagram. And the impact, as Morgane said, comes from the participant's experience of the process. So when you're using a CLD, you need to facilitate it really skillfully so that it creates open dialogue, collaboration, shared perspectives, and learning. And we want you to really keep this in mind today, and we'll keep referring back to this point. Next slide, please. Before we begin, we have a few guiding principles for the day to keep in mind over the course of the workshop. We will be in a learning and brainstorming space today. So first, we ask you to practice empathy, actively listen to others, and meaningfully consider their perspectives. Second, we ask you to defer judgment, hold off on forming opinions too quickly, and keep an open mind. Lastly, be patient. So as Katie said, today is fast-paced. We're trying to get through a lot in a short amount of time, and you won't be a CLD expert after today. Today might be a frustrating process. We heard a lot from the last process that closing the loop was really hard, and we hear you. It's challenging for us too when we're mapping a new map. It takes thinking and practice and more practice, and frustration is just part of the process. And today we give you full permission to feel frustrated. Just know that if you keep practicing, it'll get easier. Next slide, please. This slide is a summary of the steps to facilitate the co-creation of a CLD. You'll see 6 steps listed here. And in the last session, we jumped right to step 3. If you remember, the bulk of the session was us focusing on drawing nodes and linkages and making those arrows. This time, we will be walking through the entire process from steps 1 through 4, and then steps 5 and 6 we will focus on during session 3. The first step of creating a CLD is gaining preliminary insight through research. The second step is identifying 6 to 8 priority forces. And these forces are the key ideas that shape the way a system behaves. And generally, we create time for ideating these priority forces in a brainstorming space, and then we narrow down using a voting process. Step 3 is identifying nodes and linkages to create loops for each of the forces. Step 4 is each loop will also create a narrative. This helps improves comprehension and serves as a way to test the logic of your loops and for you to ask yourself, what story is my loop telling? And does it make sense? Step 5 is linking the loops together to see how different forces in the system are interrelated. This step takes quite a bit and can be challenging, and this will be the bulk of our focus for next session. And then lastly, just as Morgan said, the CLD does not tell you anything unless you create space for conversation. The beauty of the CLD is that it allows people to view the system in a different way and see how others might view the system differently. You can utilize tools such as leverage point analysis or stakeholder analysis to determine where the system might be ripe for change and who should be involved in creating this change. This is a really high-level summary of all the points. For those of you who are new, you might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed at this point, and that's okay. What we'll do now is we'll walk through each step one by one and get comfortable with them. Next slide, please. Let's zoom in on step 1, which is determine the system you are mapping and gain preliminary insight. So what exactly does this even mean? We'll explain in the next slide, please. For today's training, we have a case study that already presents you with the preliminary insights. In real life, if you were undergoing this process, you would gain these preliminary insights through research. You could do literature reviews, you could do interviews, focus groups. Then you would find a way to record the preliminary insight through a report, a presentation, or just as we did today, a case study. For today's case study, these are some of the high-level details that we know. The location is Machakos County, Kenya. The sector is the agricultural entrepreneurial sector. The project is called the Supporting Youth-Led Agricultural Businesses, and it's led by an organization called YEIO, the Youth Empowerment International Organization. And when you're facilitating this process in real life, you would sit down with stakeholders to decide what the boundaries are. Perhaps the location is all of Kenya and not just Machakos County. Maybe you're not focusing on a project, but a countrywide initiative to establish more rural entrepreneurs. The boundaries will vary depending on the situation. And even if it's not a project and you're co-creating a map with a lot of stakeholders, you still need a goal and an ideal state of systems and what you want the system to look like. And use this state as a North Star. In this case, as the slide shows, the goal of the YEOI is an improved economic climate for youth-owned small and medium enterprises in agriculture. And so that's the goal for today. Next slide. One of the most important parts of preliminary insights is determining all the important actors that need to be in the room. Before we bring people together, it's important to think, who are the important voices and who are the important people that will bring perspective of the system into the room. And we need to make sure that the CLD is created by a representative group of people from various parts of the system. For example, think about the representation you need in the room in terms of different genders, different ethnicities, different age groups. If you're working in a certain value chain, you'll need people from across that value chain, and you'll need people from both informal and formal sectors. As you are gathering the preliminary insight, you need to keep asking yourself who should be in the room, and you should pose this question to everyone that you talk to during the research phase, so that you're not missing any critical voices. Next slide, please. We now ask you to refer to the case study. Everyone should have read the case study before the session, but we understand that maybe some of you didn't get it. So that's okay, just skim it right now. And in the Padlet link provided, please answer the 2 following questions. Who are the actors from this case study that should be in the room? And are there any voices in the case study that we might have missed? And so Katie is sending you first the case study and then the Padlet link. And I will share the screen now to show you what Padlet looks like and how to answer the questions on Padlet. All right, I see some answers coming in. So please answer these first 2 questions. Who are actors from this case study that should be in the room? And are there any voices that the case study might have missed? And you will press this plus sign. And I think the case study might have missed the voices of the youth's parents. So I'll write that and press enter. And that should do it. So we see youth, we see private business owners, university faculty, banks, that's great, implementing partners, financing partners, SMEs, bank representatives, farmers, seems like people like that one, bank officials, private sector representatives, private sector actors. So remember to just answer the first and the second question. You don't need to be in the third question right now. We'll get to that later. We have youth and farmers, stakeholders from businesses, mentors, youth themselves, youth, commercial bank representatives, community leaders, youth government official, SMEs, private sector, bank, farmers coalition. This is great. Now let's see what people have said for any voices the case study might have missed. So we have government officials, supply chain partners, youth's parents, which is mine. People have said youth, but I believe that the youth voice is included in the case study. We have media, we have community leaders, youth in terms of what their needs and expectations are. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. I think that's true. Parents, cooperatives, community leaders, private sector, minority groups, farmers, law enforcement agencies. These are all great answers. Environmental specialists. So you can see that you need to think really big picture and think really deeply about who are the actors that might be missing and make sure that their perspectives are included. So this is great. You all have come up with actors that I didn't even think of. So you see the power of co-creation and community work. I think what I'll do now is, Jesse, if you don't mind, can you take us back to the screen that we were at? So usually co-creation involves gathering actors in a room in real life or virtual. And as facilitators, you have to put in, Jesse, can you please go to the next slide? Or perhaps previous slide, sorry. Yep, this is the right one. Thank you. Perfect, thank you. So as I was saying, co-creation involves gathering actors in a room in real life or virtual. And as facilitators, you have to put in a lot of time to prepare to facilitate a causal loop diagramming process. One important thing to remember is that facilitators do not have to be subject matter experts. The people in the room will have that expertise. However, facilitators should undergo a research process to gain knowledge about the systems, and they should know about actors in the room, who those actors will be, the context that the actors live in, and the dynamic between different types of actors that might show up in the room. And be aware of that before they go into the room. And now I will pass it on to Morgane for step 2.
Thank you, Hina. I was typing an answer to Mr. iPhone or Mrs. iPhone there, but just to answer that, yes, the groups can be huge, and something that we sometimes do to prioritize, we don't have time to really go into today, but maybe we can look at and send some resources to after this session, is systems, network sensing, and stakeholder mapping, looking at sort of organizational network mapping to see who's who, who's working on what, and what the dynamics are between them. And that can help you prioritize who should be in the room depending on what the question is you're answering. In any case, moving on to step 2, is to start to identify the forces at play. So we've got all of our actors, or the actors that we want to be in the room or in the Zoom, and we bring them together and ask them to identify what are the helping forces at play in the system, and what are the things that are hurting them in the system. Next slide, please. Thank you. If we could just put it all the way through. So the one of the framings that we use to explore these forces, just to make sure we get a full range of forces and are able to build a more full map, is the iceberg model, which I think some of you will be familiar with. So to walk through the iceberg model, we have the idea that there are events happening at surface level. So what's going on? What are these sort of one-time or visible acts that are happening? We go down one level lower to patterns and trends. What are the trends over time? What are the rules, policies, practices, and resource flows that continue these patterns? A level down, the structures. How are the parts related? How are the relationships and power dynamics between actors and resources? And all of these feed into then dictate the patterns and trends which affect the events. And then finally, we have our mental models. What assumptions, beliefs, and values do people hold about the system? And these mental models will inform the structures that are set up, which then inform the patterns and affect the events. Next slide, please. So to walk you through an example of that, if you had, for example, a man is turning up late to work one Tuesday morning after dropping off his child at daycare. His supervisor is understanding this time. That's our event. It seems like a one-time thing. So now let's look one level deeper, patterns of events or trends. The man is late on the same day the following week. Are these two events unrelated, or is this a pattern of behavior we start to ask ourselves? The next level down is the structure. This structure is the structure that supports and creates the behaviors higher up in the pyramid. So for example, the office has no flexi time policy. Our friend is late every week, possibly because the organization's policies don't take into account when daycare facilities open their doors in the morning. Moving down to our final level, we reach our mental models. And and those are the people who came before us. These affect the structures we put into place and the way that we understand the patterns and trends in the events, the top parts of the iceberg. So here we ask ourselves, why is there no flexi time policy? Is it because the management staff don't trust their workers to get the job done? What are the attitudes and beliefs at play here? So you can see that each level you go down into the iceberg offers a deeper understanding of the system being examined, as well as increased leverage for changing it. So as we're exploring forces, there are going to be forces that come higher up in the iceberg, and there are going to be forces that represent deep core mental models. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give everyone about 3 minutes to read through the case study one more time. And if Hina, you could share a link in the chat. And as you're reading through, have a think about which forces you can identify throughout the case study. These, we have some definitions here. A helping force would be a significant theme in the system or environment that supports, encourages, or strengthens the health and effectiveness of the system, as defined by the goal of the project, program, or implementation. So in this case, we're looking at what forces are helping youth participate in this YEIO program. And secondly, hurting forces. Now we're looking at significant themes in the system or environment that impair or prevent the health and effectiveness of the system. So here, what forces are hurting youth from participating in this program? And the reason I'm asking you to look at helping forces and hurting forces is key, is that it's often easier to come up with hurting forces. When we're going into a causal loop diagramming session, we're often going into it because we're at a turning point, because we've run into some problems. And so hurting forces tend to come to mind much easier, but there are some good things in the system necessarily, and those are the good things we're going to want to leverage later on. So as we're going through, have a think about the helping forces and hurting forces. And I'll give 3 minutes of silence so we can read through those now. As you're reading, Hina, could you share the link to the Padlet one more time? You'll see that the Padlet has been set up with the labels of the different helping forces and hurting forces, events, patterns and trends, and structures. So you can go into this Padlet and put in any forces that you identify from the case study. Okay, I can see we're starting to get some forces going up. Thank you so much. So in helping forces, we have a better, more central location for the YEIO programs, access to finance supported by donor guarantee funds. The banks are willing to partner. This is helping forces. In patterns and trends, we're seeing expansion to finances for youth, mentorship among banks and private sector, project support and technical assistance. And then in the hurting forces, we have time constraints, such as the need to participate in market days on the weekends. That's a key force. The presence of criminal offenders. Low interest by the private sector will be something that will need to be worked on and expanded on. That loan terms are not tailored to youth needs. And again, I guess it's important to repeat that this is just a framework. There are many different ways we could tease out what these forces are, whether they're helping or hurting. And this is just one way to flip our heads around the issue and try and break out what the different pieces of the puzzle are. So if you have a force that doesn't quite fit in or fits between two different levels of the iceberg, it's completely fine. We're just excited to see what you write in. There was a question in the chat before I switched over. Someone asked whether a helping force could be a hurting force too. And the fact is that yes, absolutely. The way that a force interacts for different actors depends on the individual, the actor themselves, and the way that they are in the system. And so one force might seem like a positive force and might be positive to some areas of the system and have a negative effect on others. So I think once we get to the next stage, the sort of helping or hurting name of these forces becomes irrelevant, because then we're looking at cause and effects, and there are positive things that lead to negative things and negative forces that might lead to some positive outcomes. Great to see Daniela responding to questions in the chat for us. Okay, once you've entered your 3 helping forces and 3 hurting forces, please do have a read through the other forces that your colleagues have entered. And you can see you can add little hearts next to ones that stand out to you as most interesting or most powerful forces within the system. And you can add comments there too.
And so, as Morgan said, the hearts and the comments would be really helpful if you were doing this in a workshop setting, and we would actually be voting on our top helping and hurting forces, and then moving forward with those votes to then start creating the causal loop diagram. And so you could see how this can lend well to a virtual setting if we were, had time to go through the entire process and we're in a 4-day workshop. So I'm seeing some hearts starting to be populated.
And Bangura, you can add comments by clicking the add comment button. There's a little bug next to it underneath the heart. Helena, I'm going to put a pin in your question about fitting assumptions in the CLD, and we'll make sure we'll bring those up later on. Okay, Katie, could you take us into the next step?
Thanks, Morgan. I think this is me. But for those of you in the last session, the next few slides will be familiar. I will give you a recap of the components of a CLD and an example loop. Please pay close attention to this. This is a good review and a chance to hear the material again so that it really sinks in. So let's break down the elements of a CLD in the next slide. A CLD consists of nodes, or the item, activity, or behavior that is changing, and linkages, the arrows that show how the nodes are related. On the linkage or the arrow, you'll see a directionality shown by which way the arrow is pointing, and the polarity, which is shown by the plus and minus signs. So in this example, you'll see that polarity shows us how one node influences the next node. Node 1, as it decreases, which is symbolized by that minus sign by node 1, as node 1 decreases, then node 2 increases. And then as node 2 increases, then node 3 decreases. So let's carry this over to a real example. Here's an example. This loop is a high-level loop that shows the intended impact of the YEOI program. And I know it's not a loop yet, but we will make it into a loop. And this is from the case study. The way that you would read this chain of events right now is if there is adequate funding for youth programs, then youth businesses will expand. And as youth businesses expand more, then the YEIO project will be more successful. So right now, this is a chain. How do we make this into a loop? We'll show you in the next slide. So we know that looping is hard, and I had to think a little bit deeply about making this loop, but I got to it. So closing the loop is what allows us to describe the systemic process of feedback, and thus the patterns of behavior within a system. In this particular case, if you start out with adequate funding for our youth, as that increases, there's an increased expansion in youth businesses. Then the YEIO project will be seen as successful. And as the YEIO project is more successful and is seen as more successful, it will catch the attention of other funders and it will get more funding. Then, because there's more funding, there's more adequate funding for youth, and then the cycle continues. When the cycle continues like this, it's called a positive reinforcing loop. You see that all of the signs in this are pluses. There can also be negative reinforcing loops, and there's different ways of labeling what each loop is. We won't be getting into that for this session, but we will send you resources on how you can decide what kind of a loop you're drawing. Next slide, please. Now we hand it over to you. We'll take some silent time to zoom into paragraph 1 of the case study. Remember the helping and hurting forces that Morgan walked you through before building your map. What we'll do is we'll put on the timer for about 10 to 12 minutes and give you some quiet time to loop paragraph 1 on a piece of paper. To get you started, we have 2 nodes. We have, you'll see on the screen here, as youth business experience is low, which is what we know is the phenomenon happening in the system right now, then the need for training in BMP, best manufacturing practices, is high. And that's how we started our loops, but you don't need to start at this point. This is just an example, a thought to get you going. Feel free to start wherever you want in the case study. And we'll start the timer now for 10 minutes. I'll repeat the instructions one more time. So just grab a piece of paper or a pen and pencil and read paragraph 1 and start looping it. Remember the helping and hurting forces that we came up with in the previous activity that Morgan led you through. And this is independent work. You'll do this by yourself for 10 minutes, and then we'll all come back together and go through the loop for paragraph 1 that we came up with as GKI. And then we'll move on to breakout rooms and do another looping exercise. For those of you who might have just joined us or might have not heard my instructions earlier, we are mapping paragraph loop 1 of the case study. You'll see the screenshot here, or you can access larger text in the case study itself. We have about 8 minutes remaining of our silent time, and then we'll go through the loop together.
Okay, so we shortened this a little bit. If you don't have a loop, that's okay. I'm going to invite Hina to actually share her loop that she created in a platform that we often use for group co-creations called Mural. If you're not familiar with Mural, it's a very cool platform that you can use to sort of have virtual sticky note spaces. So you can use Post-it notes and sticky notes via online, and you can have many people collaborating in one part. And so I'll give Hina a chance to explain and walk us through her loop, and then we'll share and talk about how we might add to this loop. Over to you, Hina.
Thanks, Katie. My loop is through the perspective of YEOI, and it shows the ideal state of affairs if everything went as planned. But I had a hard time looping and showing what's actually happening, especially from the students' perspectives. Let me just walk you through what I have and show you where I got stuck. And then maybe you can help me out in terms of walking me through what I have. So I started off with the hints that we gave everyone, which is youth experience in best manufacturing practices is at a low state right now. So it's decreased, which means that there is an increased need for training in best manufacturing practices, which is this plus sign. And as the need for training in best manufacturing practices is increased, then the number of trainings offered by YEIO is also increased. As the number of BMP trainings offered by YEOI increases, then the number of youth interested in these trainings also increases. And as the number of youth interested in these trainings increases, then youth should attend more BMP trainings. And I would say this is where I got stuck, because I know that youth are not attending BMP trainings because of market days, but I didn't know how to fit that into this loop. And you'll also see that I tried to show that the youth aren't attending through this minus sign, but I know that this isn't right because you can't carry this plus sign and make it a minus like this. And so I needed to switch the signs, but I didn't know how to do it. And I didn't know how to add this additional trainings are on the same day as market days. And that's where I got stuck. Over to you.
Yeah, I think this is a really good example of sort of a new thing that we haven't talked about and haven't explained with causal loop diagramming. So Hina, if you scroll over to my loop, I'll sort of explain what I did and see what you all think about that. The beginning of our loops looked exactly the same. So I also started up at the top with youth experience in best manufacturing practices being low. And that led to an increased need for training. And then that led to an increased number of trainings being offered by YEIO, which then led to an increase in the number of youth interested in the trainings. However, as you said, we know that, so then we know that the number of youth wanting to attend the trainings is high. However, they're not attending the trainings. And so the way that I showed this extra factor of the trainings being held on the same day as market days was this green node. And so oftentimes in system speak, we call this like a phenomena or something that makes it sound more complicated than it is. But what this means is it's simply an input to the system that changes the way, the directionality and polarity of the loop. And so because the trainings are held on the same day as the market day, we then on the other side come out with youth not actually attending these trainings. And so when the youth don't attend this training, it means that they aren't then trained in business experience and best manufacturing practices, which then means that there is a negative, the project is not successful. The YEIO project is not successful. And so from that, in the case study, it also explained that when the youth are not able to attend because of these market days, the youth have the perception that, or the YEIO have the perception that the youth are unmotivated, which causes some distrust between YEIO and the youth, which also then hinders the success of the YEIO intervention. And then if you look at this bottom very large loop, the bottom little part, from when you have a lack of trust between YEIO and youth, that also leads youth to no longer be interested in these trainings because they're feeling as though they are not being heard. And so I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat, and I will try to get to them. But the point of this is to explain this idea of the green input to sort of display something that is perhaps out of YEIO's, they could have asked youth and expected this or figured out that it was on the same day as a market day, and they could have perhaps designed the trainings better to fit the needs of the youth. And so when I look at this loop, what I see is that there was a lack of communication between YEIO and youth, perhaps. And if they had talked to youth about what days would have worked for them and used some, as we often call it in international development, some human-centered design, they could have perhaps avoided this challenge of youth not actually attending the trainings. They also would have avoided this perception that youth are unmotivated, because it turns out that's not actually true. But that is what YEIO thought when the youth were not attending the training.
But it's not too late for YEIO, right? We're imagining this scenario. They're in a systems mapping workshop. We've got YEIO actors, we've got our youth actors. And I think this idea of the ideal versus real situation causal loop is a really important one to get to the bottom of. You could imagine, if this is a role-playing situation, that the ideal loop that we saw would have been drawn by a YEIO program officer who's saying, this is how we initially designed it, but you can see that there's everything in place for young people to join these programs, but it's not happening. Why is that not happening? And then in a workshop situation, we might bring them together with a youth who will help them understand why that extra element that's coming in, which is our green element. Now that green element won't end up on its own. That ends up being part of a whole separate loop. But in this case, we're only showing one piece of it.
Yes, thank you, Morgan. And so I think, expanding on that point, our sort of workshop that we are taking you through today is based on the YEIO project, and they are already 8 months into the project, as the case study tells us. And so they're sort of at this inflection point where they're able to change and talk with youth and figure out sort of what went wrong. And this green node really signifies an opportunity for them to change and adapt based on the needs of the youth. If, as what I was talking about earlier, if you had used a causal loop design process at the design of the actual intervention, perhaps this could have been avoided. And so I think this shows that causal loop diagramming can really be used at any point throughout the program cycle. Even in an evaluation, it can also show you perhaps what went wrong and how you could adapt for your future programming. And so really in any instance, you can use causal loop diagramming to inform decisions.
Great. Katie and Morgan, I have a quick question. So should my loop have looked like this, or could I have come up with a completely different loop? And how do you kind of put those together if people in the room come up with two completely different loops?
It's very, very rare, Hina, that you would be drawing a loop on your own. Usually the way this would work is you'd be working in a pair or in a trio or 4 of you, and those 4 would be selected either randomly or by the facilitator, specifically bringing together 2 actors that they think might have divergent ways of seeing the system. And together these 2 actors will agree on a way of presenting the loop that feels most accurate. And so really this is back to our magic conversations piece that we keep bringing up, that coming out with this final combination of 2 loops that might change some of the positives to negatives or take in other perspectives is where the magic really happens. And that process of coming up with the final loop.
Yes, and I'd just like to point out that in the chat, Lisa has asked if projecting both ideal and real loops is an opportunity for dialogue. And I would definitely agree. That's sort of what we're trying to explain. You would very rarely be creating these loops on your own. You would be creating them hopefully in a room with a diverse set of actors who all see the system very differently. And so it's not necessarily ideal versus not ideal, it's the different perceptions of the people in the room. So how is each person experiencing the system? And by walking through that and seeing the different perspectives, you're able to realize maybe where there was miscommunication, where there could have been a different approach taken, and then you can sort of begin those conversations of how you might work together better in the future. And Wallace also made a good point that in this loop, the motivation could have been that the project didn't have transport reimbursement for the participating youth, which can also lead to the youth not attending. So that could also be a green input to this loop. So Hina, I would like to pass it back over to you. I'm thinking that we might not have time for breakout rooms, but I would like to get y'all's thoughts on that.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, I think we're pretty pressed for time now. So what we could do, we have a few options. We could just open it up for questions and just focus on this one loop, or we could take some more silent time to loop the second loop that we have, and then just get as far as we do, and then we'll continue on with that loop next time. So what does everyone think? Katie and Morgan, I'll let you decide. Can all the participants tell me their preferences in the chat? I see one do another loop together from Audrey as a group. Another, let's do a second loop. One person is saying focus on this loop.
Sounds like
okay, why don't we do that? It looks like most people prefer doing another loop together. And so we can move into that. Our plan was to do this in breakout rooms, but since we are kind of running out of time, let's skip breakout rooms for now and just work as a whole group together. I think that's fine. And so what we'll do is we'll refer back to the case study and we'll loop paragraph 2, and then we can walk through what we have together. And let's say 5 minutes silent time, and then we can all come back together again. And this time, instead of me presenting my loop, we might have one of the participants present their loop to Katie, and then Katie will walk you through what you might be missing, what you did well, and any gaps that you might need to fill.
a fun way to do this, I've noticed some people in the chat are doing this already, is to put on the hat of one of the actors within the room, imagining that you're taking part in one of these workshops. And maybe you're a banker, maybe you're a bank official, maybe you are a youth who owns an SME, and see what that loop would look like from your perspective. And then you can go back into the same loop again, imagining it from someone else's perspective. All of these experiences will help you when it comes to facilitating a session to think about what the dynamics are at play and how they intersect.
So as you all are looping, I also want to emphasize one additional point that we haven't really talked about. And I think when mapping from a case study, it can be easy to follow the order of the sentences. But in your loop, you don't necessarily need to follow that order. You can, if you're feeling stuck, you can start at a different point and try a different way of creating the loop. I know that the closing the loop is oftentimes the hardest part. And so sometimes working backwards from the starting node, the other direction can be helpful. And sometimes just scrapping your loop and starting all over again from a different starting node can help you think about the system in a different way so that you can actually finish that loop. And so I would urge you on this part to not necessarily do the loop in the order of the sentences, but to perhaps start in a different point, or as Morgan had said, put a hat of someone else on so that you can think through different perspectives.
All right, so in the interest of time, what we'll do is recognize that you might have not gotten super far with this loop. That's okay. You can keep practicing after this. And what we'll do is we'll present the loop that we came up with here at GKI and see how everyone feels about that one. So I'll share my screen again on Mural, and Katie will walk us through GKI's loop. Let me share.
So while Hina is sharing, I would like to answer the question from Jessica Howard, asking, do you find you come up with the best loops when you list a bunch of different factors, or to think about one topic and then loop that impact? And so I think this would be dependent on how you loop, and I think there's probably no right answer, but I can speak from my perspective and what I like the most and sort of explain why. For me, I find it easier to focus in on one topic and then think about its impact, because you can easily get taken off into another loop. And so if you have all of these factors, you might create a bunch of like maybe 10 half loops, but not finish any of them. And so for me, it's easier to focus in on one topic. And I think in a facilitation, it's also easier to ask the participants to focus in on one topic, or else you all will be going in like 10 different directions and perhaps not finish any of the loops. So that's from my own experience, but I think it is probably a personal preference.
It is the way that we tend to do it at GKI, as Katie said, is to have people exploring each force. So as you remember that first step we were listing out the positive and the negative hurting and helping forces. And then what you would do is have participants vote on which are the top 3 helping and top 3 hurting. And that way, if you build a loop out of each of those forces, you end up with a really balanced map that's representing the top level forces that people identify. If we go into each factor at that level, we might end up with a really unbalanced map based on what we had time to explore, rather than exploring the forces that were voted on at the beginning.
Perfect. So when looking at this loop that GKI created, as we have said, this is most likely, actually there's probably no way your loop looks exactly like this one. This is from, mine and Hina's and Morgan's perspective. It is not necessarily the truth loop. There are no truth loops when mapping. It's just all based on people's perceptions. And as we looked at in the iceberg model, we all bring our own mental models. And so this is based on perhaps my mental model of the situation and what I'm bringing in my past experience. And so we've tried to label this for ease of reading, but if you start in this upper top linkage where there's a start button, the increased need for youth SME funding leads to the increased establishment of multi-stakeholder loans, a loan fund for youth SMEs. That leads to increased number of stakeholders that have their own set of loan requirements, which leads to very strict requirements for the loan. And so in this loop, the way that I perceived it is that the strict requirements for this loan was sort of the challenging factor. It was what was making it difficult for this loop to succeed in the way that YEIO had thought it would succeed. And so with the strict loan requirements, if you follow this bottom larger loop, that led to a decrease in the number of youth actually applying for the loan, which led to a decrease in the adequate funding for youth SMEs, which led to, for the youth SMEs to not expand, which led to the idea that the Youth YEIO project was not successful. And so with that caused an increased strain in the relationship between the bank and the YEIO, with that strained relationship, that decreased YEIO's willingness to challenge the power dynamics. And so when they weren't willing to challenge the power dynamics, that caused the strict loan requirements to remain the same and not change as the youth had asked them to change it. And so when those strict requirements remained the same, that led to this top loop of youth feeling unheard because the requirements were not changing. And then that caused a lack of trust from the youth in the YEIO project. And so if you think back to the past loop, trust was something that was in that loop as well. And so one of the questions was, do these loops connect? How do you connect them? And so once you create your individual loops, the goal would be to figure out what are those nodes that are the same across multiple loops. And then you begin pulling them together and you would create one full causal loop diagram. And so that is what we'll do in our next session that we hope you join us for. So we're running out of time quickly, so I will pass it over to Hina to walk us through the final homework and notes for next session. And I'll just encourage you all to keep asking questions in the chat. We'll look at them and try to respond to them in the next session since we're running out of time. Over to you, Morgan. Hina.
It's me. I just need to share my screen. Give me 1 second. Katie, do you actually mind sharing the slides? All right, let's go to homework for next time. Great, thanks, Katie. So as you know, if you want the certificate of attendance, you will need to attend all 3 sessions, but then there's also a short assignment for each of the weeks. And this week, we ask you to loop the 3rd paragraph and send us a photo so that we can check how you do. It does not have to be a perfect loop. It doesn't even have to loop all the way. We just want to see your thinking and the effort that you've made. And we'll send a link out for a Google form where you can submit that either tomorrow or the next day. So make sure to complete this homework assignment and to be able to get your certificate of completion. Next slide, please. If you have any questions, email us at info@gkinitiative.org. Our Twitter is GKI Initiative, and follow us on LinkedIn for @the Global Knowledge Initiative. I know that there's a lot of questions remaining, and we really hope to see you next time so that we can dig a little bit deeper and get more comfortable with looping. As we've continued to repeat in this session, a lot of looping is just practice. And so keep using the case study, keep practicing, do it with your friends or your colleagues, and it's a really fun activity to do together. So we encourage you to do the homework and get other people involved too. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.
And one last note, we will share a link to a discussion that we're going to start on youthpower.org. So if you have more questions, and I'm sure you all do, please refer to that. We'll share a link to the discussion board with the PowerPoint and all at the end of this. So be on the lookout for that. Thank you all, everyone, for your time.